It may come as no surprise that President Trump's philosophical disagreement with the existence of Amazon continues to make headline news. And even though I spent the majority of last week's episode covering this topic, I was planning on going deeper. But I can't do it. I don't want to talk about Amazon right now. I don't want to talk about Donald Trump. Frankly, I don't want to talk about Facebook or Mark Zuckerberg. And that leaves me with a bit of a dilemma because that doesn't leave me with much to talk about. But then my friends at Apple, they came to the rescue. Because of all of the news with Trump and Amazon and Facebook, Apple has been making some very interesting decisions that have been not ignored by the press, but I don't think that these decisions are being looked at holistically, and I don't think people are paying as much attention to these decisions as they should. But luckily for you, thanks to my apathy for Trump and Amazon, I'm going to dedicate this episode to Apple. We're going to track their decisions about how they are trying to control their supply chain and move their company forward. So this week, we're talking about Apple. I'm Joey Lombardi, and this is SourceCast episode 114. Hey, did you hear the news? Apple has announced that they are planning on replacing Intel CPUs in laptops and desktops sometime by 2020. If you are an Intel stockholder, you probably are aware of that news because your stock dropped 9%, but basic consumers probably don't care, and the change is 2 years away. But after such a long relationship, why is Apple replacing Intel? According to a Bloomberg article by Ian King and Mark Gurman, these Intel chips are one of the few remaining major pieces that aren't controlled by Apple. At the moment, all iPads, iPhones, Apple Watches, and Apple TVs use CPUs designed by Apple. And those CPUs are based on ARM technology, which the new CPUs will also be based off of. The major reason why Apple's replacing Intel is due to vertical integration. If Apple controls the chips, and Apple controls all of the other hardware components, that makes for more seamless integration between their software and their hardware. And that gets you things like better battery life and snappier performance on the machine that you're using. Another reason why Apple may be moving away from Intel, according to a Verge article by Vlad Savov, is that Intel is stagnating. The article basically calls out Moore's Law and says that Intel hit a plateau in 2015, and we're only seeing incremental performance improvements. By shifting away from Intel, Apple is looking to change their whole desktop platform. And this article goes into deeper details about how Apple controls almost every chip within their machines as it is. Apple's basically staking their future on the concept that it will be better served building its own chips as opposed to relying on another company. Savov ruthlessly points out that Apple is on a 2-year life cycle with most of their products, and they have conditioned their consumers to be ready to upgrade every 2 years. He goes on to say that Intel is grateful if a computer consumer upgrades their machine every 5 years. As smartphones and tablets become more expensive, and Apple has effectively conditioned consumers to pay over $1,000 for a new smartphone, I think we're actually going to see smartphone growth slow down because they're getting so expensive. And I think it will actually start to emulate the PC market more closely, and people will probably replace their phones every 3 to 4 years, especially if they're becoming more powerful. That's not to say that Apple and Google haven't figured that problem out as well, because the hardware tends to slow down for a variety of reasons, air quote, variety of reasons. And while Google hasn't yet admitted to tampering and bricking some of their older tablets and smartphones, Apple has. And they have cited the battery as the reason why they slow down older phones, but I'm not sure I completely believe that. While it makes a lot of sense for Apple to switch to their own CPU, it's not going to be easy. Brian Barnett of Wired.com spells out some of the difficulties that Apple will face during their transition from Intel to a new ARM processor. The first problem is that the ARM-based processors are not nearly as powerful as Intel, and the ARM processors likely won't catch up to Intel in the next 2 years. As a point of comparison, an ARM processor will likely be comparable to a Core i3 Intel or maybe a low-end i5, says Patrick Moorhead, who's the founder of More Insight and Strategy. But there is a silver lining. Apple makes their own GPUs. They did this about a year ago. And the GPU chips that they're putting in these machines, both desktops and mobile devices, can help offset the limited processor power of the ARM CPUs. And again, if Apple is designing everything, there will likely be more efficiencies, even though the CPU is less powerful. But there is another problem basing your architecture off of the ARM processors, and that's that the applications themselves have to be recompiled to work on the new architecture. Moorhead goes on to say that there is no magical way that Apple can make that problem disappear. Just like when we saw Apple going from PowerPC to Intel, there wasn't some magic way to make PowerPC apps on the Mac just work on Intel. A lot of them had to be rewritten. The general consensus is that Apple will likely release these new machines on a staggered approach, most likely focusing on entry-level and low-end Apple machines initially. And as the processors and the efficiencies become more powerful, they'll eventually replace their top-tier machines. I want to go back and call out the fact that Apple quietly replaced the GPUs of their machines a year ago, and it didn't get a lot of press. Now there's a pattern developing. They replaced their GPUs, they're replacing their CPUs, and oh, by the way, they also announced a couple of weeks ago that they're making their own screens. According to a Bloomberg article by Mark Gurman, who we mentioned earlier, Apple is focusing on developing a next-generation micro LED screen. Apparently, these screens are totally different than the current OLED displays, and they promise to make phones slimmer, brighter, and less power-hungry. Those lovely benefits come at a major cost. At the moment, micro LED screens are very difficult to produce. In fact, they were so difficult that Apple almost killed the project a year ago. But Apple's engineers persevered, and they've made enough progress that Apple believes they can roll out the technology in a few years. Like with the CPU news dropping Intel stock, news of Apple making screens slaughtered a couple of companies. Universal Display, who owns some of the OLED patents, their stock took a 16% hit on the news that Apple's moving to micro LEDs. Samsung and a few other screen manufacturers also took hits on the news. And again, just like the switch from Intel, mass-producing new screens will not be easy. It will require new equipment, they might need new manufacturing plants, and Apple will likely have to outsource production to minimize their risks. And that means having to let other manufacturers, like in China, see their proprietary designs. In the past, Apple has taken measures to protect their supply chain. They have hoarded raw materials, they have purchased other companies, and now we're seeing them take the next step in controlling the overall design of their machines by literally designing and creating everything that goes in their machines. I can't sit here and say it's a bad move. Apple is the #1 smartphone manufacturer. They have a dedicated fan base for their laptops and for their desktops when they decide to make them. Controlling every aspect of what goes into those products is the smart move. Another smart move that Apple made is poaching Google's AI chief and bringing him into the fold, into the Apple core. The former chief of Search and Artificial Intelligence, John Giandrea, has been snatched from Google and brought over to Apple. Why did Apple want Giandrea? It's because of Siri. Siri, which was once the queen of the personal digital assistant, she's fallen on hard times. She's become basic. Both Amazon and Google have surpassed Siri when it comes to those personal assistants. They can do more, and Siri has fallen behind. Here's a little bit more about Giandrea. He joined Google in 2010 when the company gobbled up MetaWeb. That company was building a database of the world's knowledge, and Google snapped that up and incorporated it into their search results. Giandrea became so integral to Google that they moved his office right beside Chief Executive Sundar Pichai. The New York Times' Jack Nickus is hailing this move as a major win for Apple because the company desperately needed a win in AI, and they have achieved it. I've mentioned on previous podcasts and on blog entries that AI talent is very hard to come by in Silicon Valley, and it's getting to the point where many of the top companies have silent agreements that they will not poach university talent because those professors need to remain behind to teach the next generation of AI talent. So a lot of the recruiting at the moment has actually been happening in China, when these companies can actually get talent from China to leave. We've only seen a handful of these major AI talents leaving one company for another, but I suspect this may be the start of an AI talent war. Apple is making some moves right now. They are controlling their supply chain. They're making their own CPUs. They're making their own GPUs. They're making their own screens. They have poached one of the premier AI talents on the planet to lead their AI division and to make Siri not suck. Apple's already on top, and they are making decisions to ensure that they remain there for a long freaking time. Good job, Tim Cook.
And that's all we have for this week. You can find SourceCast on iTunes, Google Music, and all of your favorite podcasting applications. SourceCast is recorded in Bucolic, Mantua, New Jersey, and it's produced by my dad. The outro is performed by me, Ben Lombardi, and music is provided by Patrick Lee. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.